The wind dragged dust across the hard pan earth, carrying with it a brittle smell of sweat, leather, and dry wood. A woman stood at the threshold of a ranch house whose paint had long peeled away, revealing gray timbers that creaked like an old man's bones. Her face bore the weary marks of labor and long years without kindness, her eyes heavy with a sort of fatigue that sleep could not mend. She had once been spirited, or so the neighbors whispered, but time and the weight of a loveless marriage had pressed her spirit into silence. Her husband, a man built of muscle, greed, and an unyielding sense of possession, watched her with a gaze that cut sharper than the spurs at his heels. She had grown tired, too tired for his taste, too tired for his pride, and in that exhaustion he saw only insult. The day began as most had before, chores done without gratitude, meals prepared without praise, silence where laughter once might have dwelled. But this day carried with it a storm, though the sky was clear. The husband gathered a handful of men outside the ranch house, all of them drawn to the spectacle he was about to stage. His cruelty thrived when fed by an audience. He dragged forth the woman, forcing her before them, her hair unkempt, her skin roughened by sun and toil. She did not plead, for she had learned that words against him only sharpened his hand. She stood in silence, waiting for whatever humiliation he had designed. In the yard, tethered to a post, stood a man with shoulders broad enough to bear the world's disdain. His wrists were bound, though he carried himself with the dignity of one who could not be broken, only contained. He was a slave, purchased like cattle, made to labor in fields not his own. His eyes carried no defiance, nor did they hold submission. They held instead a quiet fire, something that unsettled the husband, for he could not stamp it out. The husband's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and theatrical. He declared that his wife, being too tired, too dull, too useless for him, would serve as punishment by being given to the slave. Laughter rippled among the onlookers, men whose hearts had long forgotten decency. The wife's face did not change, though inside her soul reeled. To be degraded before others, to be cast aside as if her worth were no greater than a worn boot, tore through her dignity. The slave did not speak, yet his jaw tightened. His gaze flicked toward her not with lust or triumph, but with a weight of unspoken understanding. With a shove, the husband pushed her toward the slave. Rope snapped loose from his wrists, and she stumbled against him. The contact startled her. His skin was warm, his grip steady as he caught her to prevent her fall. The husband spat in the dust and barked his final command. Both were to leave his land. They were nothing to him now, refused, discarded to the wilderness. The laughter faded into silence as the men dispersed, leaving only the sound of the wind and the cracking of dry earth under their boots. The woman stood frozen, shame tightening around her throat. She did not weep. Tears had been spent long ago. The slave, now untethered, picked up the small satchel thrown at his feet, a miserly collection of scraps and tools, hardly enough for one soul, let alone two. He looked at her, and in his gaze was not pity but steadiness, as if he had seen cruelty before and learned to walk beyond it. Without a word, he began to step away from the ranch, toward the horizon where land stretched endless and unforgiving. She hesitated only a moment before following, for there was nowhere else to go. They walked under a sun that showed no mercy. Dust coated their tongues, and the path dissolved beneath their feet. She stumbled often, unaccustomed to such aimless travel. He adjusted his pace for her without speaking, slowing his stride though his body yearned for distance. When they reached a dry creek bed, he paused, crouched low, and examined the soil. His fingers pressed into the date, seeking signs of water. She watched him, uncertain, but something about the way he moved suggested knowledge older than chains. He found a small pocket of dampness beneath the surface, enough to fill their palms. She drank, grateful though the taste was of mud and stone. As night came, the wilderness revealed its teeth. Coyotes howled across the plains, their cries circling like vultures. The slave gathered wood with practiced precision, sparking a fire that sent light flickering across his face. The woman sat across from him, the glow drawing out lines of weariness she had hidden during the day. For the first time, she allowed herself to speak. Her words came low, roughened by silence. She asked him his name. He regarded her a long moment, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes, and shook his head. A name, he seemed to suggest, was not a thing safe to share in a world where it could be used as another chain. She looked away, chastened, but not angry. She realized then how little she knew of him, though he had worked within sight of her for years. He had been invisible to her world until her husband chose to use him as a weapon. Now here they were, bound together not by choice but by survival. She wondered if her fatigue had been the reason her husband despised her, or if it had merely been an excuse. She thought of the years spent in silence, the bruises hidden, the loneliness endured, and felt the ache of wasted time. The days stretched into a rhythm of endurance. He led, she followed. He found berries that did not poison, roots that gave strength, paths that offered cover from the burning sun. At first she resented the silence between them, the gulf of unspoken words. But slowly she began to understand that silence could be shelter. He did not press her with questions, did not demand her history, did not wield her weakness against her. He simply moved forward, and in his steadiness she began to feel the faintest spark of safety. Still, her shame weighed heavy. Each time she stumbled, each time her body betrayed her with exhaustion, she feared he judged her as her husband had. Yet when she collapsed one afternoon, her knees buckling under heat and hunger, he did not sneer or walk away. He lifted her, carrying her until shade broke the sun's assault. When she woke, his arm was beneath her head, steady as stone, his eyes watchful as if guarding against both beast and man. She whispered thanks, the word catching like an unfamiliar prayer. He nodded once, accepting, though still he did not speak. Their exile became more than punishment. It became a journey through the raw edges of existence. At night she dreamed of the ranch, of the husband who had thrown her away, of the men who had laughed. She woke in sweat and fear, yet each time the fire's glow reminded her that she was not alone. She began to study the man beside her, the curve of his shoulders, the careful way he handled every task. He bore his past in silence, but she knew it was heavy, perhaps heavier than her own. One evening, as thunder rolled across the horizon, they took shelter beneath a rocky outcrop. Rain hammered the earth, filling the air with a scent of renewal and decay. She found herself speaking again, confessing fragments of her life. How once she had believed marriage would bring security, how dreams had dwindled into drudgery, how every day had become a test of endurance. He listened, his gaze steady, his hands busy tending the small flame that fought against the storm's breath. She realized then that he carried himself not as property, not as a man broken by chains, but as someone who knew survival was more than breath. It was dignity. The rain ceased by dawn, leaving the earth slick and shining. They rose, continued their march through mud that sucked at their boots. The landscape stretched wide, endless, indifferent. She felt both small and strangely free, no longer confined by walls or her husband's shadow. Yet fear lingered. Fear of the unknown, fear of starvation, fear of what lay ahead. Still, with each step she took beside the man, she felt less like a discarded possession, and more like a soul clawing back her own existence. One night, when the fire dwindled low and stars scattered like shards of ice, she whispered that she was no longer tired, not in the way her husband had claimed. She was weary, yes, but it was a weariness of someone who had carried too much for too long, not the useless exhaustion of a broken thing. The man's eyes lifted to hers across the fire, and though he did not speak, something in his expression told her he already knew. The days ahead promised trials greater than the ones they had yet faced. Hunger gnawed at them, storms threatened, and the memory of a vengeful husband lingered like a shadow. Yet in that moment, beneath the endless sky, she felt the faint stirrings of a truth she had long forgotten. Even in exile, life could begin anew. The wilderness stretched ahead in a blur of dust and thorn, the horizon so distant it seemed to retreat with every step. Each morning began with silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on hard earth and the rasp of breath pulled into lungs starved of comfort. The woman, once bound by the routines of her husband's ranch, now discovered how raw survival carved itself into flesh and spirit. Her body trembled under the weight of exhaustion, but she forced herself forward, unwilling to become dead weight beside the man who walked with such relentless steadiness. He moved like he belonged to the land, measured, precise, never wasting strength. Though word did not pass between them, every glance and gesture spoke volumes. On the third day of their wandering exile, hunger pressed its claim upon them. The woman's lips cracked, her stomach twisting with hollow pain. The man left her seated in the shade of a fallen tree while he moved silently into the brush. Minutes stretched like hours. She listened to the calls of crows circling overhead, the scuttle of small creatures hidden among roots, and the faint rhythm of her own heartbeat, anxious and uneven. When he returned, he carried berries cupped in his palm and roots slung in a strip of torn cloth. She eyed the offerings with suspicion, uncertain whether they were safe, but hunger triumphed over doubt. She tasted the bitterness and sweetness alike, and though her stomach protested at first, strength seeped back into her limbs. That evening, he showed her how to strike stone against steel to coax sparks into fire. His hands worked with patient certainty, every movement deliberate. She tried to mimic him, her strikes clumsy and hesitant, but at last a spark caught, flame flaring to life. For the first time since her husband had cast her aside, she felt a small swell of triumph. She looked at him, seeking approval, but he gave no smile, only a nod, subtle, respectful, acknowledging her effort without condescension. Their nights became chapters of endurance. The wind carried cries of wolves, sharp and predatory, echoing across plains that seemed endless. She often woke with fear clawing her chest, certain some beast lurked just beyond the firelight. Each time, she found him awake, sitting with his back straight, eyes fixed into the dark as if daring the night itself to challenge him. She began to understand that silence was his shield. He spoke nothing because words were fragile, but watchfulness, vigilance, that was survival. One afternoon, while crossing a narrow ravine, the woman slipped, her foot twisting against stone. She gasped, tumbling to her knees, pain lancing through her leg. Panic surged. If she could not walk, she would be a burden impossible to bear. He crouched beside her, examining the swelling with a gentleness that startled her. From his pack he drew strips of cloth, binding her ankle with care, his touch firm but never cruel. She watched his hands, scarred and strong, yet capable of tenderness that no one had shown her in years. He lifted her then, carrying her across the rocks as if her weight were nothing, his breath steady against the strain. In his arms she felt both shame and comfort, shame for her weakness, comfort in the fact that he bore it without complaint. The land tested them without mercy. Storms came, hammering the earth with sheets of rain, turning dust into sucking mud. They huddled beneath crude shelters of branches and hides he fashioned, their bodies pressed close against the cold. The storm roared like an angry beast, but within the cramped refuge she found herself listening to his breathing, steady and deep. In that rhythm, she discovered a fragile sense of safety, as if his presence alone could shield her from the fury of the sky. Days later, another threat revealed itself. Not nature, but men. Bandits rode the plains with hunger for plunder. From a ridge, the woman spotted riders in the distance, their laughter carried on the wind. Fear seized her chest. The man motioned for silence, guiding her into the cover of scrub and stone. They waited, crouched low, hearts hammering. The riders passed, their voices jeering, their shadows dragging long across the ground. When the danger faded, she let out a trembling breath, realizing he had placed himself between her and the riders, his body ready to shield Hay from discovery. That act, silent and instinctive, lodged itself in her heart. Yet it was not only external threats that tormented them. Inside her, storms brewed with equal violence. She wrestled with shame, the memory of being discarded, the sting of humiliation. Her husband's words echoed, too tired, too useless. Each time her muscles failed or her spirit faltered, she feared proving those words true. But in the man's gaze she never found mockery. He offered no judgment, only a quiet expectation that she rise and continue. That quiet faith, unspoken yet unwavering, became both burden and balm. She began to push herself harder, not for her husband's approval, but because this man who owed her nothing still bore her survival with him. One night, after a long day of travel, she dared to speak. Her voice cracked, raw from disuse. She asked why he had not abandoned her, why he had not left her to falter alone. For a long time, he said nothing, eyes fixed on the fire. Then, with a voice rough like stone dragged across earth, he spoke a single truth: no one deserved to be thrown away. His words carried weight far greater than their simplicity, carved from a lifetime of being treated as less than human. She felt the sting of tears then, not of weakness but of recognition. She saw him not as a punishment, but as a man who carried scars deeper than her own. From that night forward, their silence shifted. It was no longer a gulf between strangers, but a shared space, comfortable and steady. She began to notice small things, the The way he offered her the choicest portion of food, the way his eyes softened when she stumbled yet rose again, the way he kept to her side in rivers swift with current. These gestures, unspoken, began weaving trust between them, thread by fragile thread. As weeks stretched onward, her body hardened. Muscles once softened by domestic labor grew firm beneath the strain of constant travel. She learned to track small animals, to read the bends of rivers for fish, to braid rope from grasses. Each lesson came from his demonstrations, never lecture, always patience. She grew stronger, not because he carried her, but because he had shown her how to carry herself. For the first time in her life, she felt ownership of her survival. But survival was never a gentle teacher. One evening, as twilight sank, a wolf pack circled their camp. Eyes glowed from the dark, low growls vibrating in the air. She froze, terror rooting her in place. He rose, spear in hand, shoulders squared against the encroaching beasts. The wolves lunged, teeth flashing white. He struck swift, driving one back, another down. She found herself clutching a burning branch, swinging it wildly, her scream echoing into the night. The fire's fury drove the beasts away, yelping into shadows. When it ended, her body shook uncontrollably, but in his eyes she saw not disdain, only respect. She had stood beside him, not behind. That night she lay awake, realizing the truth. She was no longer merely surviving under his protection. She was surviving with him. Her dreams, once filled with her husband's cruel laughter, began to change. She dreamed of firelight on his face, of rivers crossed hand in hand, of a silence that felt like peace rather than punishment. She woke each morning with the ache of longing she did not yet understand. It frightened her as much as it steadied her. He was still bound by the chains of a world that refused his humanity, and she was still a cast-off wife marked by shame. Yet in the wilderness, stripped of society's judgment, there were only two souls fighting for life. Their journey reached a turning point when they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin nestled deep in the woods. Its roof sagged, walls weathered, but it offered shelter greater than the open plain. Together they repaired it, her hands working alongside his, weaving branches, patching gaps, sealing the roof. In that act, they built more than walls. They built the first fragile semblance of a home neither had known in years. As she swept the dirt floor, watching dust scatter like memories in sunlight, she realized how much had changed within her. She was no longer the woman too tired to be wanted. She was a woman alive, reshaped by struggle, reborn in exile. The cabin did not promise safety forever. The world outside still harbored dangers, bandits, beasts, and the memory of a husband whose cruelty had not yet ended. But for the first time, the woman felt a seed of hope take root within her. She looked at the man across the room, his figure tall against the flicker of fire, and understood that he had given her more than survival. He had given her back her sense of worth, not through words, but through every act of shared endurance. And yet, beneath that fragile peace, shadows gathered. She knew the past was not done with them. The man who had cast her aside would not rest, his pride wounded, his control challenged. Somewhere beyond the horizon, danger stayed. But for now, within the humble cabin, with the scent of wood smoke in the air and the steady rhythm of his presence beside her, she let herself breathe freely, if only for one night. The air shifted before the danger revealed itself. The forest, once alive with the chatter of birds and the sigh of wind through branches, grew unnaturally still. The women sensed it in her bones, a silence heavy with intent. She paused at the doorway of the cabin they had labored to repair, her hand still carrying the grit of work, her breath fogging in the morning chill. The man, standing at the edge of the clearing, had already noticed. His eyes narrowed, scanning the tree line, every muscle taut. He needed no words to tell her what she already knew. The past had come hunting. Their fragile peace had lasted mere weeks. In those weeks, they had built something unspoken, a rhythm born of survival and mutual respect. She had felt the unfamiliar warmth of safety, the kind that rested not on walls or possessions but on trust. Yet safety was fragile, and prideful men never forgot humiliation. Her husband's voice haunted her dreams, harsh and mocking. Now, she feared that voice was not confined to memory. It would return in flesh, bringing with it the violence of wounded pride. By midday, the confirmation arrived. Tracks carved fresh into the soil, the imprint of horses shod in iron. A group moved with purpose, closing the distance. She and the man followed the trail from the cabin to a bluff where the valley stretched wide. There, smoke curled against the horizon, a signal fire lit by riders marking their presence. Her heart clenched with dread. She knew the man who had cast her aside would not come alone. He would bring others, men hungry for blood, eager to prove their loyalty. That night, neither slept. The fire burned low, its glow faint against the oppressive dark. She sat wrapped in a tattered blanket, watching the man sharpen a blade with methodical patience. The sound of stone against steel was steady, a rhythm that calmed even as it reminded her of the violence to come. She wanted to speak, to tell him of her fear, but words felt fragile, almost intrusive. Instead, she watched his hands, the strength in them, the quiet resolve. In that silence, she understood he would fight not because he sought death or glory, but because there was no other choice. When dawn broke, the riders arrived. Dust rose before them like a herald, the thunder of hoofs echoing through the valley. Her husband rode at the front, his face twisted with the pride of a man who believed himself wronged. His eyes locked onto Hayes, and in them she saw not love, not loss, but ownership. She was still his possession in his mind, a discarded object he now sought to reclaim, if only to prove that no one could take what belonged to him. The riders dismounted, spreading wide in a semicircle around the cabin. Weapons gleamed in the pale light, rifles cradled with easy menace. Her husband stepped forward, his voice carrying across the clearing with cruel authority. He mocked her weariness, spat words dripping with disdain. He spoke of the shame she had brought him, of how she had sullied herself with the man who stood beside her. Every word struck her like a lash, but she held her ground. For the first time, she did not lower her gaze. The man at her side remained silent, his presence steady as stone. He did not flinch, did not rise to the bait of insult. Instead, he placed himself subtly between her and the armed men, his body forming a barrier. Her husband noticed the gesture and sneered, drawing his pistol as if daring the slave to act. The standoff stretched taut, every heartbeat heavier than the last. Then, with a barked order, her husband signaled his men to seize them both. The first rider lunged, and the struggle erupted. The man fought with ferocity honed by years of survival. His blade flashed, his movement swift and decisive. The clearing became a storm of chaos, gunshots cracking, shouts rising, the thud of fists and boots against earth. The woman, though unarmed, did not stand idle. She seized a fallen branch, swinging it with desperate strength against a rider who closed in on her. Pain seared her arms, fear clawed at her chest, yet she refused to yield. The battle raged, brutal and raw. The man's shoulder took a bullet, blood soaking through his shirt, but still he pressed forward, driving back those who sought to surround him. His eyes burned with a defiance that no chain had ever extinguished. She watched him, torn between terror and awe, realizing that his fight was not only for his survival but for hers as well. Her husband charged into the fray, pistol raised, his face twisted in rage. He aimed for the man, but in that moment she moved without thought. She threw herself against him, the shot veering wide, the crack of gunfire echoing through the clearing. They grappled, years of pent-up fear and anger fueling her strength. He struck her, the blow splitting her lip, but she did not fall. She clawed at him, fought him with every ounce of fury long buried. The man closed the distance, wrenching the pistol from her husband's grip with a force that shattered bones. The two men locked in brutal combat, fists colliding, bodies crashing against the date. It was not a fight of equals. One carried arrogance, the other carried necessity. Every strike from the man was driven by survival, every block by the will to endure. At last, with a final blow, her husband collapsed, the fire of pride dimming in his eyes. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged sound of breath. The riders, seeing their leader defeated, scattered into the trees, unwilling to risk more blood. The clearing, once a storm, became still again. The woman stood trembling, blood on her hands, her chest heaving with the aftermath of violence. The man, wounded and weary, leaned heavily on his blade, his gaze meeting hers across the distance. In that moment, everything unsaid between them surged like a tide, gratitude, respect, something deeper that words could not contain. She approached her husband's fallen form, looking down at the man who had once controlled every breath of her life. He was not dead, but broken, stripped of the power that had bound her. She felt no triumph, only release. She turned away, leaving him in the dust of his own pride. Her steps carried her back to the man who had fought beside her, who had risked everything without claiming ownership. They returned to the cabin, his wound bound with trembling hands. As she tended him, her touch gentle yet determined, he finally spoke again, his voice rough with pain but steady. He told her she was no longer bound, not to her husband, not to the life she had left behind. She was free to choose her path, to walk where she wished. His words cut deeper than any blade, for in them was a truth she had long forgotten. Her life was her own. For days, they remained in the cabin, the quiet broken only by the rustle of leaves and the crackle of fire. She thought of the road ahead, of what it meant to live beyond survival. The bond between them had been forged in fire and blood, tested against both nature and man. It was not built on possession or desperation, but on the steady rhythm of trust. When the time came to leave, she stood at the threshold once more, the forest stretching endless before her. He shouldered his pack despite the lingering pain, his eyes steady, waiting. She looked back at the cabin, at the life they had carved from exile, and forward at the uncertain horizon. Choice lay heavy in her hands, but for the first time it was hers alone. They walked side by side into the vast unknown, not as master and possession, not as punishment and victim, but as two souls bound by survival and tempered by respect. The land would test them still, dangers would rise again, but she no longer feared. She was not too tired. She was alive, and in that life she carried the quiet strength of the man beside her. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised shades of crimson and gold, she felt the weight of her journey settle into something like peace. The road was not an ending but a beginning, bittersweet and uncertain. Love, in its truest form, did not demand chains. It walked beside her, steady and silent, asking nothing but giving everything. And as the wilderness swallowed them once more, their story continued, carried on the wind like an echo of resilience, of reckoning, and of a choice finally her own.